Today we discuss about Laravel events. In this section, we are having topics like introduction, registering events and listeners, defining events, defining listeners, queued event listeners, dispatching events, event subscribers, testing. And apart from these main topics, we are having subtopics like generating events and listeners, manually registering events, event discovery, manually interacting with the queue, queued event listeners and database transactions, handling failed jobs, dispatching events after database transactions, writing event subscribers, registering event subscribers, faking a subset of events, scoped events, fakes. So like this we are having main topics and subtopics in events module. Let's see one by one. So Laravel events provide a simple observer pattern implementation allowing us to subscribe and listen for various events that occur within our application. Event classes are typically stored in the app/events directory, while their listeners are stored in app listeners directory. Events serve as a great way to decouple various aspects of our application, since a single event can have multiple listeners that do not depend on each other. Let's see registering events and listeners. The app providers, event service provider included with our Laravel application provides a convenient place to register all of our application's event listeners. The listener property contains an array of all events and their listeners. Generating events and listeners. So we will be using artisan command called php artisan event :generate. So this is a command which we are going to generate events. Alternatively we may use make : event and make : listener artisan commands to generate individual events and listeners. For example, php artisan make event podcast processed. Also php artisan make listener send podcast notification --event equal to podcast processed. So like this we will be using make event and make listener artisan commands to generate individual events and listeners. Manually registering events. Typically, events should be registered via the event service provider $listen array. We may also register class or closure based event listeners manually in the boot method of event service provider. So in the boot method, so we will be using the syntax like this: event scope resolution operator, listen, function podcast processed $event property. So like this we will be using the event service provider, and boot method. Within the boot method we will be using the listen $listen array. Let's see queuable anonymous event listeners. When registering closure based event listeners manually, we may wrap the listener closure within the illuminate events queuable function to instruct Laravel to execute the listener using the queue. So it will be like this. The syntax will be like this within the boot method: event listen queuable of function of podcast processed $event. So like this we will be using the queuable anonymous event listeners. wildcard event listeners. We may even register listeners using the star as a wildcard parameter, allowing us to catch multiple events on the same listener. Wildcard listeners receive the event name as their first argument and the entire event data array as their second argument. So event listen event dot star comma function of string dollar event name comma array dollar data. So like this we will be using the wildcard event listeners. Let's see event discovery. Instead of registering events and listeners manually in the $listen array of the event service provider, we can enable automatic event discovery. When event discovery is enabled, Laravel will automatically find and register our events and listeners by scanning our application's listeners directory. So in addition, any explicitly defined events listed in the event service provider will still be registered. Laravel finds event listeners by scanning the listener classes using PHP's reflection services. When Laravel finds any listener class method that begins with handle or _invoke, Laravel will register those methods as event listeners for the event that is type hinted in the method's signature. So the handle method will be like this: public function handle of podcast process $event void. So like this it will be, we will be enabling the event discovery. Event discovery is disabled by default, but we can enable it by overriding the should discover events method of our application's event service provider. So if it returns true, so it will be in enabled mode. Event discovery is in enabled mode. So by default, all listeners within our application's app listeners directory will be scanned. So if you would like to define additional directories to scan, we may override the discover events within method in our event service provider. So discover events within method. So all listeners within our application's app listeners directory will be scanned. So it will be like this, the method will be like this: protected function discover events within array within the function. So return $this app path of listeners. App discovery in production. So in production, it is not efficient for the framework to scan all of our listeners on every request. Therefore, during our deployment process, we should run the event cache artisan command to cache a manifest of all our applications, events and listeners. This manifest will be used by the framework to speed up the event registration process. The event clear command may be used to destroy the cache. Event clear command, PHP artisan event clear command may be used to destroy the cache. Defining events. An event class is essentially a data container which holds the information related to the event. For example, let's assume app events order shipped event receives an eloquent ORM object. So we will be using a public function within the constructor public order $order. So like this we will be using the order object. For example, here use app models order. This is the order models, and we will be using within the construct, so public order $order. So like this we will be using the events. Defining listeners. The event :generate and make listener artisan commands will automatically import the proper event class and type hint the event on the handle method. Within the handle method, we may perform any actions necessary to respond to the event. So it will be like this: public function handle order shift $event :void. Stopping the propagation of an event. So sometimes we may wish to stop the propagation of an event to other listeners. So we may do so by returning false from our listeners handle method. Queued event listeners. Queuing listeners can be beneficial if our listener is going to perform a slow task such as sending an email or making HTTP request. Before using queued listeners, make sure to configure our queue and start a queue worker on our server or local development environment. To specify that listeners should be queued, add the should queue interface to the listener class. Listeners generated by the event :generate and make listener artisan commands already have the interface imported into the current namespace, so we can use it immediately. Should queue interface. For example, class send shipment notification implements should queue. So like this we will be using the should queue interface to the listener class. Customizing the queue connection, name and delay. If you would like to customize the queue connection, queue name or queue delay time of an event listener, we may define the $connection, $queue or $delay properties on our listener class. For example, public $connection equal to SQS, public $queue equal to listeners, public $delay equal to 60. If you would like to define the listener's queue connection, queue name or delay at runtime, so we may define via connection, via queue or with delay methods on the listener. So these three methods, public function, via connection method, via queue method, with delay method. So these three methods will be used if you would like to define the listener's queue connection, queue name or delay at runtime. Conditionally queuing listeners. We may need to determine whether a listener should be queued based on some data that are only available at runtime. So to accomplish this, a should queue method may be used to a listener to determine whether the listener should be queued. The should queue method returns false, the listener will not be executed. Whenever it returns true, then only listener will be executed. Within this conditionally queuing listeners. Manually interacting with the queue. If you need to manually access the listener's underlying queue jobs, delete and release methods, we may do so using illuminate queue interacts with queue triad. The triad is imported by default on generated listeners and provides access to these methods. Interacts with queue. And this is a triad which we are going to use in order to interact with the queue. Interacts with the queue. Interacts with queue. Queued event listeners and database transactions. So when queued listeners are dispatched within database transactions, we may be processed by the queue before the database transaction has committed. So when this happens, any updates we have made to models or database records during the database transaction may not yet be reflected in the database. If our queue connections after commit configuration option is set to false, we may still indicate that a particular queued listener should be dispatched after all open database transactions have been committed by implementing the should handle events after commit interface on the listener class. Should handle events after commit. This is the interface we will be using in order to dispatch of all the database transactions that have been committed. Handling failed jobs. Sometimes our queued event listeners may fail. If the queued listener exceeds the maximum number of attempts as defined by the queue worker, the failed method will be called on our listener. The failed method receives the event instance and throwable that caused the failure. Specifying queued listener maximum attempts. If one of our queued listeners is encountering an error, we do not want it to keep trying indefinitely. So Laravel provides various ways to specify how many times or for how long a listener may be attempted. We may define a tries property on our listener class to specify how many times the listener may be attempted before it is considered to have failed. Public $tries equal to 5. This is a $tries property on our listener class. So with this we will be specifying queued listener maximum attempts. $tries property. TRIES. Public $tries equal to 5, for example. An alternative to defining how many times a listener may be attempted before it fails, we may define a time at which the listener should no longer be attempted. So this allows the listener to be attempted any number of times within a given time frame. So to define the time at which a listener should no longer be attempted, add a retry until method to your listener class. So this method should return a datetime instance. For example, public function retry until method :datetime return now add minutes of 5. So like this we will be using the retry until method. Dispatching events. To dispatch an event, we may call the static dispatch method on the event. So this method is made available on the event by the illuminate foundation events dispatchable trait. So any arguments passed to this dispatch method will be passed to the events constructor. If we would like to conditionally dispatch an event, we may use the dispatch if and dispatch unless methods. Dispatching events after database transactions. So sometimes we may want to instruct Laravel to only dispatch an event after the active database transaction has committed. To do so, we may implement the should dispatch after commit interface on the event class. This interface instructs Laravel to not dispatch the event until the current database transaction is committed. If the transaction fails, the event will be discarded. If no database transaction is in progress when the event is dispatched, the event will be dispatched immediately. Event subscribers. Let's see writing event subscribers. Event subscribers are classes that may subscribe to multiple events from within the subscriber class itself, allowing us to define several event handlers within a single class. Subscribers should define a subscribe method which will be passed an event dispatcher instance. We may call a listener method on the given dispatcher to register event listeners. So like this, event subscribers are classes that may subscribe to multiple events from within the subscriber class itself. If our event listener methods are defined within the subscriber itself, we may find it more convenient to return an array of events and method names from the subscriber's subscribe method. Laravel will automatically determine the subscriber's class name when registering the event listeners. Registering event subscribers. After writing the subscriber, we are ready to register it with the event dispatcher. So we may register subscribers using the $subscribe property on the event service provider. Testing. So when testing code that dispatches events, we may wish to instruct Laravel to not actually execute the events listeners, since the listeners code can be tested directly and separately of the code that dispatches the corresponding event. Of course, to test the listener itself, we may instantiate a listener instance and invoke the handle method directly in our test. So using the event packets fake method, so we may prevent listeners from execute the code under test and then assert which events were dispatched by our application using the assert dispatched, assert not dispatched and assert nothing dispatched methods. We may pass a closure to the assert dispatched or assert not dispatched methods in order to assert that an event was dispatched that passes a given truth test. If at least one event was dispatched that passes the given truth test, then the assertion will be successful. So if you would simply like to assert that an event listener is listening to a given event, we may use the assert listening method. After calling event fake, no event listeners will be executed. If your tests use modal factories that rely on events such as creating a UUID during a model's creating event, you should call event fake method after using factories. Faking a subset of events. If you only want to fake event listeners for a specific set of events, we may pass them to fake or fake for method. We may fake all events except for a set of specified events using the except method. Scoped event fakes. If you only want to fake event listeners for a portion of our test, we may use fake for method. That will be in camel case too. Fake for method. So this is all about events module in Laravel. Thank you so much. This is Universal Horse Star Ravindar Reddy Yampalla. Thanks to all of my fans, supporters and followers, and special thanks to all of my YouTube subscribers. Thank you so much.